Welcome back to Careers and Coffee Talk. I'm your host, Laura. After Hurricane Katrina, public trust in Fema was badly shaken. Rebuilding that trust came down to whether the system actually delivered for people. My guest today is Craig Fugate, who led Fema through years of reform, major disasters, and a renewed focus on outcomes for survivors. Before that, he ran emergency management in Florida through back-to-back hurricane seasons that tested every assumption about readiness, response, and recovery. But what's always stood out to me about Craig's career is not just the scale of the disasters that he's led, but it's the way he talks about responsibility, about pushing systems to work better for survivors. So today we're walking through his career journey from the early days in Florida, through rebuilding Fema after Katrina, to the consulting work that he's doing now to train the next generation of emergency managers. And we're looking ahead at what the field needs to become in a world that's changing and changing fast. Let's get into it. Sir, thank you so much for being here. It's such a pleasure to have you.
My pleasure.
So, of course, this is Careers and Coffee Talk. So, I always like to start by asking, do you have your coffee ready?
Just made it.
Yeah, that's perfect. So, before we get into it, I always like to go kind of way back to the very beginning, before your career ever took off. When you think back to when you were a kid, which, fun fact, by the way, we share the same birthday, May
Uh,
14th. When you think back to your childhood, was there anything in particular that you thought you might become one day?
yeah, I thought I was going to farm. My
Yeah?
grandfather did that. My family had cattle at one point, so um, I did ag in high school as
Okay.
part of the Future Farmers America, and so I thought that was where I was going to go. But economics and reality, that wasn't what happened.
Yeah, you chose something a little bit even more difficult potentially.
Well, got out of high school, was going to school, really hadn't decided what I wanted to do, and got recruited to become a volunteer firefighter.
Okay.
And the first thing they did says we need you to go to EMT school. And I had grown up watching emergency on television with Johnny Engage and rescue,
Hmm.
uh, you know all that stuff. And so I went to EMT school, found that fascinating, and ended up going from volunteer to working for the county, starting out driving ambulances and then a paramedic and ultimately a lieutenant with fire rescue. And so I thought that was where I was going to go.
Hmm.
And then uh, I just made lieutenant. I got a phone call to come downtown for 2 weeks for administrative reassignment. They wanted all the lieutenants to get some time in the office because most of us were what they called feral. We'd never worked in management or administration. And
Sure.
so they gave me several projects to pick, and there was one updating the county's disaster plan. That was one I picked. And I remember it because it's February 1987, and I never went back on the road. I mean, that just kind of took off, and I ended up running the county's emergency management program.
Okay. And what interested you most about that? What was it that really pulled you in?
Um, as a paramedic and stuff, I'd already been involved in several of the disaster exercises, which I found rather they weren't very inspiring. And
Yeah.
um, I started reading through the statutes, and this is an interesting time in emergency management. You weren't seeing a lot of hurricane activity, particularly in Florida in the
Hmm.
80s. You were still at the tail end of uh, preparing for nuclear war. We called it
Hmm.
population protection plans or relocation plans, like we're going to move people out of the target areas as if that was going to be any good. And it was also when there had been several big chemical incidents, one in Bhopal, India, one in Institute, West Virginia. It prompted Congress to pass what became known shorthand as the Superfund Reauthorization and Amendments, or SARA Title III,
Hmm.
which began adding requirements to plan for extremely hazardous substances that were in communities. And that was the time I got into it. So it was like I'm still dealing with nuclear attack plans. All of a sudden,
Hmm.
planning for hazardous chemicals was huge. And it was like, just identifying the areas and then mapping out potential threat areas, then planning the evacuations for that. So there wasn't a lot of hurricane activity, yet it was a very busy time and it's very transitional. You were going from the old civil defense to emergency management. Um, there hadn't been a lot of big disasters in Florida,
Hmm.
but Florida had that history of hurricanes, and it was almost like I got on the ground floor as things were changing.
Yeah. Yeah. So you really got to see things evolve quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, everybody talks about cyber security these days. I said, well, when I started out, our cyber was a fax machine, and if somebody got that number and started sending unsolicited advertisement, it would burn up all your thermal paper.
Yeah, it's times have changed a bit since then, haven't they?
Yeah, I'm thinking of all the things people don't understand when you're talking about anymore. When you talk about BlackBerry thumb, they go, "What are you talking about? What's a BlackBerry?" I'm like, "Yeah, you."
What is that? Yeah.
When they came up with the BlackBerry phone, everybody thought, "Well, now I can do everything." And then we keep now where uh, the idea that your phone can GPS camera. I mean, when I started,
Everything.
these were like hundreds of thousands of dollars of investments to have all this capability, and now I can get it pretty much on my phone.
Yeah, that's all you need. It makes carrying things a lot easier, I'll tell you that. When you look back, aside from that, the technology evolving, what do you see that's different about disasters or leading through them from what you saw at the start? Because you mentioned there was, when you first started, right, less hurricane activity. What are you seeing that's different now?
Well, it's not different. I mean, that's the thing. Everything's different. I'm like, no, it isn't. It's pretty much basically the same thing. But
Yeah.
what I saw was if you haven't had a lot of disasters, you
Hmm.
tend to have paper plans you can't really execute. I think Florida went through this with Hurricane Andrew, where they thought they had a good system, and Andrew showed they didn't have a system to
Sure.
speak of. And it's things I've learned over time. There weren't changes, but I understand better. Is this tendency to plan for what we're capable of and
Hmm.
what has happened, but not what could happen. And then
Hmm.
we always hope the plans will scale up. And I'm like, I've never seen anything scale up. I mean, Florida did not scale up in Katrina. The national FEMA system did not scale up in Katrina. You get all these events, and the more everybody talks about is the complexity of everything. I'm like going, it's not that. The disasters I think, maybe they're more frequent,
Hmm.
uh, and their intensities are growing, but the response to things you need to do, that really doesn't change. So I think there's this tendency for people to make it overly complex, and then they can't understand
Hmm.
why they can't implement their plans.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to get into that time period too. You mentioned, 80s, 90s, not a ton of hurricane activity, but you certainly made up for it between the 2004, 2005 hurricane seasons, right? And just to give listeners some context, 4 hurricanes in 6 weeks, just in the 2004 Atlantic hurricane season alone, one of the deadliest and most costly seasons in history at that time. 2005, of course, you had Katrina, Rita, and Wilma. Extraordinary damage, extraordinary loss of life. What did that period, because of course now at that time you were at the Florida Division of Emergency Management, what did that permanently change about how you lead?
Well, it validated several things. One was, when I got into the business, it's very hierarchical. You're taught, locals will run it until it exceeds their capabilities, and then you'll request assistance from the state, and the state will then
Hmm.
supply assistance till it exceeds their capabilities, and then you go to the federal government. And it's like each domino had to fall.
Hmm.
And in Hurricane Andrew, there was a big gap between what had happened on the ground and what people thought they knew. If you go back, you can remember the county basically saying initially they thought they had dodged a bullet because their EOC was up near the airport, and they were getting what they would normally expect to see: trees down, power line outages, but pretty manageable. And like many other people, they judged a lot of the severity of these storms by 911 calls. So they weren't getting a lot of 911 calls. So they're thinking, yeah, we
Hmm.
dodged a bullet, but they only knew as far as they could walk, as far as they can see, and where they were at wasn't that bad. And you go down, start heading south, you get down to about 122nd Street. From there south in Miami-Dade County, it was totally destroyed.
Yeah.
And so there was a lag between the initial assessments and what ultimately happened. And it was like a process of discovery. They really
Hmm.
didn't know until people got down there how bad it was. And then communications was so bad, even getting down there didn't mean it got back quickly. So the state's response to that was, well, we need to do better and faster assessments. So we're going to build these teams to go down and after these storms to do the assessments so that we get a better report quicker.
Hmm.
Problem was, and this is the thing I always marveled at, they always told us you're on your own for the first 3 days. And I'm like, why? Well, because it takes that long to assess it, that long to get it back up, that long to ask 27,000 questions on do you really need that, and then to figure out where it's going to come from and get it moving. And I kept seeing that as we sent these teams in, they were called rapid impact assessment teams. I said, well, they
Hmm.
weren't rapid, they grew. Everybody wanted to be on the teams.
Hmm.
And it was still taking us too long.
Yeah.
And so we skinnied it up. We thought we were going to get better. Same problem. So we get to 2004, and I wanted to try something different. I said, why don't we just don't do assessments? What do you mean? I said, why don't we respond like it's bad? Oh, we can't do that. And I'm like, where's that written anywhere in law that says we
Hmm.
can't go based upon an assumption that we just got hit by a hurricane that it's going to be bad? Well, we don't know what to send. I'm like, we've been doing hurricanes long enough in this country. We have a pretty good idea what the immediate priorities are going to be. And as
Right.
far as how much, who lives there, what's the population? And and Hurricane Charlie, it was actually the second storm that year. We had gotten hit with a tropical storm the day before up in the Big Bend area. And so when Charlie hit, we began pushing stuff almost immediately. And in about 36 hours, we were putting out supplies, and that had never been done before.
Hmm.
Uh, Search and rescue teams were down there. We ended up evacuating several hospitals because it hits on Friday the 13th. We evacuate several hospitals. I mean, it is a full-on response, and it was about
Hmm.
the fastest response we ever had. And then we get, Francis comes in. Francis was a very wide, broad storm. There wasn't like a center point of anything. It was just wet and nasty across the state, power outages everywhere. But again, we weren't waiting, and we were getting in quickly. By the time we got to Hurricane Ivan, we were actually getting in and on the ground, putting stuff out within the first, 24 hours.
Yeah.
Heard of. But what we were doing was we were working very closely. We had a state meteorologist, Ben Nelson, working with the Hurricane Center and National Weather Service offices, and we were gauging when the storms would be passing through and it would be safe to come in behind them. We weren't going to put people out there, in hurricane force winds, but we
Sure.
weren't going to wait for the sun to come up, and we had begun moving and staging resources. And again, another lesson out of Hurricane Andrew was building very strong state mutual aid networks
Hmm.
for the unimpacted areas. So everything from fire to public works to emergency managers, we could move, stage. We figured out we could do our own contracting. We didn't have to depend only on FEMA for resources.
Hmm.
And so I think the thing that we learned out of that was um, we just got faster and faster because we weren't waiting for people to tell us how bad it was. We
Yeah.
just assumed it was bad, and people said, "Well, that's you guys are being cowboys, all this other stuff." I'm like, well, the thing you never get back in disasters, and this has been true since the start. You never get time back.
Hmm. Right.
If people confuse process with outcomes, and they say they're responding, I said responding is process, and outcome is you got there in time to save people, rescue
Hmm.
people, stabilize the situation before more people died or you lost control of the situation.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, just a totally unprecedented way of doing it, but it makes sense, right? When you face, those back-to-back disasters, there is no time. You mentioned they were happening. You had a tropical storm and then a hurricane. There's no recovery window in between. So in the meantime, what are you learning about communities and what they need to help them and the people that are tasked with helping them to recover?
Well, the first thing is you got to keep people alive.
Yeah.
So as the sequence of time actually was between Charlie and Francis was 22 days. And so we had just started a recovery, and there were three counties that were totally devastated:
Hmm.
Charlotte County, DeSoto, and Henry County, and a lot of other areas got impacts. But that
Sure.
was the primary ground zero. That's where we lost so much housing, so much infrastructure, schools destroyed, fire stations destroyed. We were just getting to the early stages of recovery when Francis comes through, and we're having to stop everything and
Yeah.
redirect to that. And then 11 days later, we had Ivan out in the Panhandle. 9 days later, we had Gene back where Francis made landfall. So again, it's very simple:
Hmm.
evacuate, search and rescue, get commodities in there, stabilize the situation, reset for the next disaster.
Yeah.
And you really couldn't get to the next steps of recovery because you were so focused on the first one. But the first one
Yeah.
was you got to keep people alive. And so that was, and
Hmm.
for hurricanes, that's evacuation.
Hmm.
And so we literally would stop uh, recovery activities, the shift to the life safety until we got stabilized. So where Charlie would probably have been much further along in the recovery phase if we didn't have three more hurricanes, what was critical was nobody knew and we didn't lose anybody else from the original storms. That was the key
Hmm.
thing. Um, so it was juggling all that and having to stay focused on life safety and stabilization are your priorities.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't imagine. I experienced the 2017 hurricane season while at FEMA, and just from that perspective, just jumping from one to the other back to back like that was just, I mean, at that time, unprecedented. So let's jump into your time at FEMA. So by the time you got there, you were confirmed by the Senate in 2009. No small feat in of itself, and you stepped into a FEMA that had been, its reputation was not great at that time. What was the first thing that you knew had to change?
We had to execute.
Yeah.
Everybody was like, you got all these reputational issues and all this other stuff, and I'm like, that's not my concern. My concern is um, we're going to have to execute.
Hmm.
We need to be faster. We need to be much more aggressive in how we do things. FEMA was still very reactive. They were still very hurricane centric. They thought they had 5 days to get ready, and I'm like,
Mm.
if you have an earthquake, 5 days ain't going to help you.
Right.
So part of this was to of all the things we had to get right was response. I'm like, look, everything else it's going to be a while. If we get response right, we buy
Hmm.
time to get other things fixed. If we fail response, doesn't matter.
Hmm.
And there was a lot of people going, well, you need to do this, you need to do that. And I'm like, we're going to focus on response. That is the key thing. And so we began doing no notice exercises. We early into that first year did an event. We basically borrowed California's statewide earthquake exercise and we injected that in the FEMA headquarters with no notice, which blew everybody's mind on that. We began focusing on again moving quickly, which
Hmm.
was not something they were comfortable doing. They were very
Yeah.
much pool system. They had to wait for the states to ask for stuff. And I'm like, if we're pretty sure the state's going to ask for it, we can go. And Congress had passed substantial changes to the legislation around the Stafford Act. But one of the things they did was they clarified that if the president thought an event had occurred or was likely to occur, he could authorize FEMA to spend money out of disaster relief fund and start sending folks. Previously, it was interpreted, and some people say, well, this wasn't correct, but this is how it was interpreted. Until you had a formal
Hmm.
request from the state, you really couldn't spend that money.
Hmm.
Um, and it was not clear. And so Congress said, we're going to make it clear. If you think something's occur or is likely to occur to require federal assistance, you do not have to wait on the governor's request. You can start moving it now. Um, and so we took advantage of that. But the first real test was something that didn't even happen in the country. It was actually in one of our territories. It was America Samoa got hit with an earthquake and tsunami.
Hmm.
And again, it's a long way to get there. Everybody's wanting to do assessments. I'm like, just respond. I talked to the governor. He was actually in Hawaii for meetings, and he's telling me he's talked to the village chiefs, and they said they got the entire villages washed out. I don't know how many people are gone. The hospital got flooded.
Yeah.
Um, and so we're going to respond. And everybody's like, well, they were like real positive. The other thing is we did our first verbal uh, major presidential disaster declaration.
Oh,
I
wow.
asked her if he wanted help. She said, yeah, we called the White House and said, we need a major presidential for America Samoa. Like 4 hours later, we had the declaration
Yeah.
uh, with no assessments, which that blew a lot of people's minds. And then we started, you know, really focusing on do they need search and rescue? Do they need commodities? Do they need generators? And everybody says, well, we need to assess that. I said, no, we're sending it. And if we started getting word back that the search and rescue wasn't really going to be a big component, power was going to be the big thing because the power stations were really damaged in the flooding. And it was like trying to get people to do that. The other thing I did was I said, we're going to put the time it is in American Samoa on the wall in the National Response Coordination Center because you guys are still running on Eastern Standard Time and still doing all your briefings and meetings, and they're out of sync with the place we're helping. So we're going to put a
Yeah.
clock up there. And the other thing I did is I put a countdown clock. I want to know how many hours since this event occurred. And I said, my goal is we want it stable in 72 hours. So I had a countdown clock and I had the time zone that we were supposed to be operating in, which were not
Hmm.
things that we were used to, but it gave visual. Guys, if you're making decisions, that's the clock ticking down. Where are we?
Yeah. Yeah.
And the transport time down there is whatever you're going to do is probably 24 hours to get it down there and get it operational. So if you're still thinking about it on day one, you're not going to get there till day two, maybe day three.
Sure. You mentioned quite a few times pushing people out of their comfort zones. We do it this way because we've always done it this way. Well, now we're going to do it differently and see how that works. I think doing that requires a lot of trust, right? So how did you approach that? How did you approach building trust to be able to push people out of their comfort zones?
Well, I didn't have a lot of trust. They didn't know me. I was a state guy. I had a rather dubious reputation with people that think that I was a difficult state director to deal with. And I wasn't political, so I didn't like have patronage or somebody out there watching out for me. And I remember my chief of staff, Jason McNamara, when I get up there, says, who backs us? We don't have anybody. I said, then we're going to have to just execute faster uh, than anyone else. And so one of the things I took the approach, and again, it caused a lot of blowback among staff, especially some of the
Hmm.
career folks, was I didn't really listen to their opinions. They were used to the political person taking all this in and they would present the options and you're supposed to pick one of their options. And I wasn't even waiting for them to present it. I'm saying, this is what we're doing.
Hmm.
And I got pushback. And there was a big fear about, well, you don't understand. If we send too much stuff or we're wrong, there's going to be hearings. The IG is going to investigate. And I was like, look, I've been doing this long enough, guys. I don't care what happens. There are going to be hearings. If I'm going to testify in a hearing, it's going to go one of two ways. Either I sent too much stuff and was wasteful, and I'm like, fine, yell at me. Or I didn't send
Hmm.
enough stuff and it was bad,
Yeah.
in which case I'll either resign or be fired. And I said, here's the deal. We're going to make mistakes.
Hmm.
If we're making mistakes for the right reason, I take the arrows. The only thing I ask is be creative. Let's just don't make the same mistakes the same way twice.
Yeah.
But if we make mistakes because you're failing to do your job, you are not, supporting this. If for whatever reason, you're doing any things that I just like, I don't even want to give you a chance to resign. I want to fire you for
Hmm.
harassment or any of that nonsense. Um, is But if we make mistakes because we're trying hard and it's an honest mistake, that's me. That's my
Yeah.
job.
Yeah.
Just be creative and do it differently next time so we're not just repeating the same mistakes.
Yeah. Don't put me on the hill talking about how, the response went bad, right? Like, let's try something that makes it go a little bit more smoothly.
I don't care if this went bad if it went for the right reasons. Again,
Hmm.
if as I try to explain to people, by the time I have good information to make great decisions, I've already
Hmm.
lost too much time. So I'm
Yeah.
going with imperfect information. I'm having to use a lot of things that I know, things that I've historically dealt with, but also we
Yeah.
had tremendous amounts of data with GIS and stuff. I'm like, guys, we if we wait until we have all the information to make great decisions, it's too late.
Yeah.
And by that very nature, we're going to make mistakes. So, and again, I think over time, people began to see that being fast bought us a lot of breathing room
Hmm.
when things didn't go well,
Hmm.
or we had challenging recoveries. That the discussion didn't start out with what we saw in Katrina is we failed them in their response.
The other change a big change, significant change for folks at FEMA was that you made it a requirement that every FEMA employee had a disaster role.
Yeah.
Um, that wasn't the case before. Why was that essential, and what did that actually mean?
Well, it has an emergency in FEMA. Got emergency in there. And the other thing is, if you look at every posting for every job description at FEMA, it has in there about 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and you need to be deployable.
Hmm.
Problem was when FEMA got created, especially with uh, the creation of DHS, there were elements brought in from the Department of Justice grant programs and other things that were not originally
Yes.
part of FEMA.
Yeah.
And there were certain areas of FEMA that were considered non-deployable. So when you actually got to the position descriptions, which is enforceable, they weren't required to deploy to disasters. And I'm like, well, this doesn't make sense. So I wanted to basically change that. I had to go back to the Office of Personnel Management. We had to go back and forth, and ultimately we got it where all new hires.
Hmm.
I said, okay, guys, when we're doing interviews, that's the first question, because if they say no,
Hmm.
then we're done.
And I can attest to that.
And when you get hired, you're going to affirm that you understand that, and you're going to do a signing
Mhm.
statement that says, I understand that I am available 24 hours a day and I am deployable. That is a condition of my employment. I got all this pushback. Well, what about ADA? I'm like, well, first of all, several of the people that had quite significant disabilities were chomping at the bit to deploy.
Yeah.
Uh, and reasonable accommodations. I said, the other thing is, what about people with small children, all this stuff? I said, look, there are three categories. There are going to be those people that go forward as part of this. There are going to be people that serve in the operation centers back in the regions and headquarters. And there's going to be people that are backfilling for everybody else doing our continuity mission. Because there's
Hmm.
certain things at FEMA you cannot just stop doing because there's a disaster.
Right.
But that meant that everybody had to have an emergency job. Either you're going
Hmm.
forward, you have an emergency job in one of the response centers, or your job in a disaster is picking up the load for your section and or maybe going somewhere else in another section to keep enough essential functions going. And again, we call those our essential functions as part of our
Hmm.
continuity plans. They don't go away just because we're dealing with a disaster. And several interesting things happened. I think one of our first, what I call huge deployments was Superstorm Sandy.
Hmm.
And I had a lot of people that had never deployed from various parts of FEMA, including grant shops and other folks
Hmm.
that came back and said, that was the best thing I ever got to do.
Hmm.
And for a lot of folks, it's the first time they actually saw a connection between what they did every day at FEMA and how it translated in the field.
Yeah.
And it's, again, I was actually kind of amazed. I had people telling me, I'm not allowed to deploy. Why not? My supervisor won't let me go. I'm like, so, okay, everybody's deployable. Now we got to train people.
Hmm.
And so that was the other thing was we started incorporating training and said, okay, everybody, it's kind of lip service, but no, when you come out of this, you need to be able to do basic incident command. You've got to know the response framework in the system, and you're gonna have to get trained. You got to work, get a position in one of the recovery center, the response recovery centers, or you got to work in a disaster recovery center, or you got to do this or that. And you got to get training on that and get your certification. And a
Hmm.
lot of in the federal government, we have between the career service and the politicals, we have the senior executive service.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of people in the senior executive service that were assuming they weren't part of that. And I'm like, no, you're all going to become type 3 federal coordinating officers. And they're going,
Hmm.
what? Because we had seen this with H1N1. When I got to FEMA, the
Hmm.
first thing we were dealing with was the potential of a flu pandemic.
Yeah.
And this is before video conferencing and other things became daily tools where we could do things virtually. So we were trying to figure out how to assign federal coordinating officers to 50 states and territories. And at that time, we weren't even doing the tribes yet.
Mm.
And we had to reach back and go, okay, if you're SES, you're a senior federal official, you're going to get minimal training. And we did that kind of as a one-off. And once I got this thing, everybody's an emergency manager. I'm like, all SESs will have to be trained to be a minimal federal coordinating officer. So if we had to do 50 states, um, and again, this is pre-COVID, but I was looking at things like disease outbreaks,
Hmm.
cyber attacks, where we could end up with multiple states far
Sure.
exceeding, because we only have a handful of FCOs, maybe 20 to 30, and most of them
Hmm.
are already working disasters.
Yeah.
So again, it was this idea that I left nobody out. Everybody had a responsibility, and it was written into the position description, so it was enforceable. You don't want to do that, you may be a great American, but you need to serve somewhere else in the federal government or leave
Yeah.
federal service and go somewhere else because FEMA has an emergency function.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I I definitely remember. So I started out at Homeland Security headquarters, which is where FEMA falls, of course. When I came to FEMA, I remember it was the first interview question, like you said. It was in the application before that, even. It was, I think I probably signed that form no less than 5 times, I was like, I got it. But I was in that cadre of folks that you mentioned who had young kids. I came to FEMA when I was pregnant with my first child. And so it always worried me, well, how would I do a lengthy deployment? My husband is a first responder. But like you said, there were other ways to serve, whether it was stepping into roles where other people had to deploy or answering calls for survivors. And then as things evolved, there became virtual deployments, where you could support virtually, like you said. So it really was, it sounded so overwhelming, but it really was possible. And like I said, it's definitely been the most challenging but most rewarding work that I've done. So a very important decision. But of course, looking back, you were there for 8 years, 2 terms. So long time. And there were a lot of decisions that you made. I'm sure some, that was a big one, right? There were other changes that you made to the agency as well. When you look back, which decisions are you most proud of, or which decision? And are there any that still weigh on you when you look back?
Well, probably the thing that we were able to get done, and it required Congress to act, so it was not easy, was an issue that came up within the first month or so I was at FEMA. I was
Hmm.
went to the Congress of American Indians,
Hmm.
uh, and I had been told before that the general process is you go there, you get up there, you read your speech, you talk all this stuff, and you leave. But I also knew there was a lot of friction. The tribes were very unhappy because the way the Stafford Act was written, tribal governments were not recognized. They had to go through the states. And for
Yeah.
some, that was fine. They had good relationships. For others, it was hopeless. They couldn't get any help. And a
Hmm.
lot of times they would have disasters that would be catastrophic, but it would never reach a state threshold. And so I did something a little bit different. Instead of going up there and reading the speech, I got off and sat down on the stage, and everybody's like, what is he doing?" And I think one of the things is you got to understand is, and this is it's a cultural thing, but it's also good for anywhere. Is
Hmm.
sometimes shut up and listen.
Yeah.
And it said me coming here and talking to you or talking at you is what I
Hmm.
really said. I said, I'm here. Tell me what's going on. And the biggest thing I got was FEMA does not recognize the tribes. You won't let us
Hmm.
get help. You got all this roadblocks and everything. So I went back. Staff says, why can't we do that? Well, the staff rec says we can. Well, then we need to amend staff. Well, no, we don't want to do that because you don't understand. There's over 500 recognized tribes. That will be a nightmare. And FEMA in general, and when I say FEMA, I'm not talking about everybody, but in general, it was like they prefer not to change this.
Hmm.
Uh, and I said we're going to change it. And I can remember it took us till Superstorm Sandy to actually get the legislation. We got it attached to the funding, and it got
Hmm.
passed. And so tribes were moved from being a political subdivision of the state to being moved over where it says, who can ask for
Yep.
president, states, territories, and federally recognized tribes.
Yep.
And then we implemented it.
Yeah.
And the sky didn't fall in. And some tribes still go through their states. Some tribes, will do their own declarations.
Hmm.
It's their decision. But I was always, everybody said you can't do this. And I'm like, it's the right thing to do. And I mean, I didn't, even the congressional committees were like, don't ask for this, don't do this. They didn't want me to push this. Fortunately, uh, we had good support on House T&I. The
Hmm.
chair, Durham, he supported this. Dan Matthews, who was the Republican lead for the staff, supported
Hmm.
it. Um, and we got it through. But when people talk about, well, you did all this stuff, I'm like going, that's probably the most important thing I did.
Yeah.
That was
Yeah.
part of it. Just every other federal agency, even the Supreme Court, recognized the sovereignty of the tribes, and the Stafford Act did.
Yeah. Yeah. And you see things like that and you're like, well, that doesn't make any sense. But still changing it is, like you said, it's an uphill battle.
Well, Aaron Davis was our ledge director, and they would you know how it was at DHS. The components would have all their ledge
Yes.
initiatives. They had to get layered in with the DHS initiatives. Then they had to get layered in with the White House initiatives,
Hmm.
and so your initiatives may get buried or not moving forward.
Sure.
So I started
Yeah.
out in here, and there was all kinds of glitch stuff people wanted to fix, but I'm like, we're only pushing one thing. We only have one agenda this year, and that's to
Yeah.
amend
And
Stafford
that's
Act.
it.
And I said, Aaron, this is it. If we don't get this done, I'm going to find a new Ledge Affairs director.
Shout out to Aaron. He got it done.
Yeah, but Aaron was persistent. and
Yeah.
laid the groundwork. And even when we got through session and it didn't happen, we had the language there, but the Senate wouldn't take it up.
Hmm.
We had built so much capital and he had worked so much on both sides
Yeah.
that when the opportunity came up to get this into the supplemental, um, he had gotten it where it got through. So um, that's probably the biggest lasting change. We actually changed the law for something I felt was
Yeah.
overdue.
It's huge. Yeah. And is there anything that you wish you had done differently?
Yeah, I wish I'd gotten there earlier and figured out that the National Flood Insurance Program thought they were an insurance company and ran it like that and caused us
Okay.
nightmares. Um, and you got this whole thing about Congress wants the flood insurance program to pay for itself and be
Hmm.
actuarially sound.
Hmm.
Then you got another whole side of Congress that wants us to pay out every time there's a flood.
Hmm.
And we're in debt. There was a whole, just all kinds of issues. They don't really want to fix it. The one time they tried to fix it, they literally caused heart failure when people's premiums shot up.
Yeah.
And the problem was the staff were running it like it was an insurance company. And that may have been the intent, but the reality was it's a safety net program.
Hmm.
And our bias should always be to the policyholders, not to, uh, in this case, the taxpayers. But most
Hmm.
insurance companies, your bias is always to your investors.
Yeah.
It's not you're trying to short the customers, but you also want to contain and minimize your cost. Well, the
Hmm.
problem in doing that and applying a lot of insurance practices to that is you're running counter to this is a government program. And now you're starting to act like insurance companies and how you're making these decisions. And that goes counter to a lot of things. And so, where we had basically built up a lot of goodwill and a lot of these responses, we lost it all in the flood insurance program. So,
Hmm.
we had to make changes. I was able to get Roy Wright ultimately to take that over. We started making good progress there. But it was really this change of mindset is guys, we're not running an insurance company,
Yeah.
we're running an insurance slash safety net program.
Yeah.
And a lot of the things we put in place to basically minimize cost aren't worth what it's, we're not saving the money. We're losing, because again, I think this is one of the things that insurance companies don't have to worry about. And the federal government's your political capital, and we're losing
Hmm.
political capital every time we go sideways on this.
Yeah. You've also talked about, I think, a big change in the mindset at the agency while you were there was that our emergency management, maybe not just at the agency, but across the field, emergency management is a shared responsibility.
Yeah,
Where do you think we still fall short on that?
I think there's this tendency, there's been a lot of shifting of responsibility for funding disasters to the federal taxpayer because,
Hmm.
quite honestly, the Stafford Act was never intended to replace everything. It was actually when Tom Ridge wrote it as a member of Congress. Uh, and Tom's got a great history, governor, ultimately Secretary of Homeland Security. But people forget he's
Hmm.
one of the architects of the Stafford Act when he was in Congress, member of the delegation from Pennsylvania. It
Hmm.
was based upon the insurance model, that insurance was your primary payer. The federal taxpayer would come in after that. And what we've seen since this, in the 80s to now is so much of
Hmm.
government has become quote unquote self-insured, which means they're going to turn to the federal government during disasters. And we've shifted so much risk to the federal taxpayers. And the thresholds really haven't kept up. So now we're in a situation where a lot of the financial impacts of disasters are not borne by state legislatures or even
Sure.
local governments. They're borne by the federal taxpayer.
Hmm.
And I think that's one area that we really need to address. The other part of it was the tendency not to incorporate the private sector and the public as part of the team. And this goes back to catastrophic disaster planning. Is there is a point where you run out of government, and what
Hmm.
I've always found was government-centric disaster response works to a point and then falls off a cliff. And I go, what else is left? And there was this big divide. They tend to, in the federal government, they tend to look at the private sector as we contract with them
Hmm.
instead of they're part of the team. And nobody trusted the public. The public was a liability. They were going to panic, all this other stuff. And I like, well, first of all, we can't do this without the private sector. They own 90+% of the infrastructure. They're
Hmm.
the ones that feed us. They're the ones that provide the medication. So they need to have a seat at the table. And that was something that really didn't occur at FEMA. And the other thing was quit calling people victims in a disaster and call them survivors. We need to empower them and recognize that the quicker we put them back in charge of solutions, the better the outcome's going to be. You can't do
Hmm.
that. I'm like, yeah, we can. Um, so stop calling them victims. Victims are the ones we lost, will mourn, but the rest of them are survivors.
Yeah.
And you should not be so arrogant to think that they need you to come save them. Because I've been to enough disasters that I can tell you the first search and rescue has never been licensed sirens. It's been
Hmm.
bystanders.
Hmm.
And the people are going, well, they're not trained. They're not going to know what to do. I'm like, if you got the luxury of waiting till somebody shows up that's got their ICS red card, it ain't that bad.
Yeah.
And they're going to act without you. So why don't you, one, embrace that and figure out, well, are there ways we can help them be more successful
Yeah.
versus we shouldn't let them do anything because they're going to do everything wrong. And I'm like,
Yeah.
well, trust me, I've seen a lot of responders do everything wrong. It ain't limited to just the public. But it's this tendency to treat the public as a liability, to treat the public as, you can't trust them, you can't use them.
Hmm.
And I'm like, all I'm saying is in a disaster, I'll give you an example. When Joplin got hit by an F5 tornado, total
Hmm.
devastation.
Hmm.
Majority of the rescues were bystanders
Yeah.
because people couldn't wait days to get rescued. People were digging them out. And it actually ran into, the White House was looking, we were getting all these shootings. They were, government, what can we do? A whole bunch of us working on prevention and stuff like that. And FEMA, we deal with consequences. And we
Yeah.
were, it was kind of interesting. I was a former paramedic. Richie Serino, the deputy, is a former paramedic.
Hmm.
We kind of looked at it from the standpoint of people are bleeding to death.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, with CDC launching Stop the Bleed, it was this idea that the quickest person next to you is a bystander. We had this data coming back from the wars on terror, where combat injuries were once considered not survivable, that
Hmm.
if they could stop the bleeding, people that had injuries that, quite honestly, nobody had ever seen survive were surviving.
Yeah.
And it really came down to when you look at people that died in these shootings, they were bleeding to death. So just teaching
Yeah.
people to apply direct pressure, use a belt as a tourniquet, stop the bleed, was engaging bystanders, was still the fastest response to change outcomes.
So whether it's a bystander, stopping the bleed or an emergency manager making a call in a disaster, it sounds like the real issue is decision making when it comes to time constraints, to pressure, right? Is that what led you to push so hard on things like open data and technology?
People say we need to do an assessment. We need to see how bad it is. I'm like, we've got all this data. Why don't we just go look at the
Use it?
population, look at the infrastructure, overlay where we
Yeah.
think the impacts are, and start running some of the models. I mean, HAZIS and some other tools were already, out there. But the tendency was we were sitting on so much data uh, that it was getting people to understand how to do it. And I remember, again, our GIS was basically printing maps. I went into the National Response Coordination Center for a time. There's just paper maps on the wall. I said, why do we have paper maps on the wall? Well, that's our situational maps. I'm like, you do realize that that data is already out of date. And we
Yeah.
have this GIS lab. Well, it turned out the GIS lab was behind CyberLocks. The Response Coordination Center would put in requests. They would print the maps out, then they put them up on the walls.
Okay.
Guys, you do realize you can actually go on your terminal and use ArcView and see all this stuff, and they can build you layer stuff. So I said, I want live data. So next thing I know, I go in there and they got PowerPoints up on all the screens. Instead of paper maps, they were just making PowerPoints. I'm like,
Right.
that's
Still a
not
static map. Yeah.
that's not what this is capable of. So I brought in Chris Vaughn, who was over at National Geospatial Agency. He had been involved in a lot of disaster response. He was uh, one of the people that really understood the power of how to use these tools. And we brought him in and made a new position, a graphic information officer, a GIO,
Yeah.
kind of the counterpart to chief technology officer or chief
Yeah.
information officer. And we get Chris in there. First thing is everybody's got their own systems, everybody's got their own data, just making it talk. And then the other thing I found was getting information across federal governments was insane. And
Hmm.
so one of the things I started pushing was let's put our data out there. Well, you can't do that. You don't know what they're going to do with it. I said, you're absolutely right. I don't know what to do with it. If it ain't classified, I think we ought to free the data and just do API
Yeah.
and put it out there. So we ended up starting that process, and sure enough, one of the first users of that were journalists who were going in and analyzing our disasters and finding all of these patterns of you know, kind of looked at it from the standpoint of just from our data that we were underserving the poorest communities and in many cases overserving more affluent communities. And we
Hmm.
had bias in our things. And, and people are going, see, we told you this is going to happen. I'm like, you're damn right it did. And I'm so glad because we didn't know this.
Yeah.
And so to me, it was always putting the data out there, make it accessible. People are going to use it in ways we never thought about.
Hmm.
Some of it's going to be critical, but it's going to expose blind spots we're not seeing. But more importantly, it's this idea that data shouldn't be transactional, that I have to
Hmm.
swap this for that. I need to see everything I got. People need to see that. I want to be transparent about what we're doing. Uh,
Hmm.
but I want people to look at GIS as a response tool, not a mapping tool. And so Chris
Hmm.
and I started working on, we were using US National Grid. I want to start stacking data layers over grids because, we'd have to go look at the hospital data, then we'd have to go look at this. I said, that's not how this works. Give me a stack and tell me everything that's going wrong in that stack.
Hmm.
And some of the simple things were like early on, just to get people to understand how that would work, is let's use a color code of red, yellow, and green for search and rescue teams. And we'll do it by
Yeah.
green. If they haven't searched it, it's red. If they're searching it, it's yellow. If they've given, they're all clear at green. And now we can populate and see how we're progressing. If we're not moving fast enough, it gives everybody a better overview of the search and rescue process. And previously, we were getting paper reports we were having to read to figure out how our search and rescue was going.
Yeah. Yeah. And since then, things have advanced even further, right? Now we're talking about AI, about automation and predictive tools. What, from your perspective, what should emergency managers be leaning into? And what do you think they should maybe be cautious about?
Um, Essentially, with AI, I'm hearing the same things I heard when we first started getting the internet. That's how old I am. You got to be careful. You can't let people have access to it. It's got bad information. It still has bad information. Now it's the number one way of getting data from the Weather Service. Back when I started out, I had to either have dial-up modems or pay a fortune
Hmm.
for teletype to get weather data, or sit there and listen to a NOAA radio to get updates.
Hmm.
The Weather Channel came about, so you could watch the Weather Channel from Weather on the 8s, but up until then, you couldn't really get radar data. You couldn't get things on demand. Now you can. Nobody even thinks about it. So it's
Yeah.
a very powerful tool. Yeah, it's got its drawbacks, but
Yeah.
it's very powerful. I look at AI the same way. Artificial intelligence is a decision support tool. It's not a replacement for people. It will allow you, and again, people say it's going to replace people. I'm like, no, but you're not getting more people.
Hmm.
And for a small, again, I came from a small county jurisdiction where it was me and one other guy. Um, the force multiplier that some of these large language models can do, the fact that
Yeah.
people are incorporating, especially into modeling, a lot of artificial intelligence to do things like, okay, here's my extreme rainfall forecast. Show me where it's going to flood.
Hmm.
Now you're getting models that are strong enough and powerful enough. They can actually show you where the flooding is going to be and where it's going to be impactful. So something we never could really do before is, can
Hmm.
we make decisions now to evacuate neighborhoods or pre-deploy flood fighting resources specifically to areas versus just, we know we're going to have flooding all over the place. Where do we start?
Hmm. Yeah, a lot of modeling was done based on historic data before, right? Now we can look ahead, we can look at predictive data, which is make
Yeah.
it makes a huge difference, right? With preparedness.
Well, part of it too is a lot of the science doesn't really change. The basic fundamentals of how water flows, the basic fundamentals of fire behavior are known. There's just
Hmm.
not been the ability to run models at scale. And one of the
Hmm.
things that artificial intelligence does, it allows you to run these at scale, uh, running multiple simulations to give you more probabilistic forecasts. And again, these are forecasts, but it's better than anything we've ever seen before. And the precision we're seeing is somewhat mind-boggling how much information we're getting. And again, this is all about speed. If I know these things are likely to occur that have not yet occurred, I can get faster at responding to them. It doesn't mean it's absolutely going to play out that way.
Sure.
It's giving me more information to make my decisions on versus I'm going to get 12 inches of rain across Central Florida. What's going to flood? And the
Uh-huh.
things that have flooded before, yeah, they're going to flood. Thing was when Hurricane uh, Irma and then later Hurricane Ian came through these areas, we were flooding in places in Florida had never flooded in people's recent. We had built city
Right.
halls and nursing homes and other things in areas that were flooding from these storms that we were like, what's never flooded before? And I'm like,
Hmm.
that's a problem because if we're dealing with extreme rainfall events that have never happened before, this is. And that's where I think AI becomes such a powerful tool, both in
Yeah.
planning, but in preparing for response, is modeling the events that have never happened before,
Hmm.
but based upon the science of the hazard, the geography, all the data we have to help make sense of that versus somebody having to put all that together in their head and try to see what could
Yeah.
happen.
Yeah, it's a lot easier that way. When you think about the younger generation now of emergency managers coming in, what do you feel like they're struggling with now that you had to learn the hard way? Maybe lessons to pass on to the next generation.
Don't confuse process with outcomes.
Yeah,
I see people get wrapped up around, you got to fill this form out. You got to do this. You got to do it that way. You got to, this is how the system. I'm like, the survivors really don't care. And so
sure.
it always comes back to, you know, you got to be able to get to the area. You got to be able to search the area. You got to secure the area. You need to stabilize the area.
Yeah.
It hasn't changed. Tools can get you there faster, but if you're waiting for more information, you're waiting for more, definitive information, you're losing time, and time you don't get back.
Right.
Uh, it was a big issue at FEMA was there was nothing that they couldn't solve by having another meeting. And I just said, stop having meetings and do it. Well, we need, no, you don't. Well, we're going to make mistakes. Yes, we are. Go. I think that's the thing that hasn't changed. And it was the hard lesson I learned. You
Hmm.
never get time back. And we
Hmm.
build a lot of processes when we're not responding to disasters that we think are going to make the disasters better. And they're
Hmm.
probably not. That's why you should be rigorously testing your assumptions and exercise the points of failure to figure out, will this actually speed things up, or is it just another process I'm going through, another loop I'm going through that's not deploying something, not getting there in time? It's like sending rescue teams. Search and rescue teams, if they don't get there in the first 72 hours, are doing body recovery. And we'll say I sent 12 teams. I'm like, that's nice. How many grid squares do you need to search? What are the what type of search are you having to do there? And are you going to get
Hmm.
to those and do that primary search?
Right.
And if you don't have enough teams, what else can you do? Because you don't get to change the timeline. The timeline is
Hmm.
people don't have that long. And I think that's the hardest thing for people to understand is they start out with their process and hope they get the solution instead of defining what is the outcome I'm trying to achieve and then
Hmm.
what do I have to do to get there? And can I take steps out that may increase risk of too much stuff, but gets me there faster? And people said, well, if you do that, you're going to run out of stuff. You're just going to waste stuff, stuff. I'm like going, there's a certain amount of that I get, but I also think that I have good data. I know my populations. I know what was there before the event. I should be making my decisions based upon people.
Hmm.
Time is my most precious commodity. So if you're saying, well, yeah, that's wasteful. So yeah, but it's faster. Time I don't get back. And I think that's the
Yeah.
hardest thing for people. They go through and everybody starts out with instant command system. Everybody starts out with, the Stafford Act. You got all these
Hmm.
stuff you got to do. And I'm like, I got bad news for the ICS crowd. NASA went to the moon and back and never heard of ICS. They did
Right.
understand management by objectives, which is what ICS is based upon. But I mean, I've seen this. People have sent back forms because it wasn't filled out correctly in a disaster response.
Yeah.
And I'm going, what part of this even makes sense?
Near the end of your tenure at FEMA, did you feel like there was still unfinished business?
Yeah, but it was, I think a lot of things were what I began to see were, from my perspective, was incremental things that we were doing. And it
Yeah.
was time for me to step down. I got asked by several people would I stay, and I'm like, guys, I've been here 8 years.
Yeah.
You need new blood in here. You need somebody with a
Yeah.
different perspective. With me, you're going to continue getting what you're getting. And that's one of the things I see in a lot of organizations is they run in that trap where same people that were the solution 10 years ago today are no longer solution. You see this in the industry all the time where
Hmm.
CEOs initially started successful, but they don't adapt or change with the times, and you don't bring in new blood till it's too late, and companies fail. So my position was 8 years. Well, it was enough for me, but it was also important that you bring in fresh perspectives and start looking at this through different lenses, so that you're
Hmm.
always improving.
Yeah. How do you feel like you can be useful now? I know you're consulting. So how are you filling your proverbial cup?
I'm staying busy because a lot of it is just as a subject matter expert is advising people, everybody from startups to, I sit on boards of corporations.
Hmm.
Um, and, I still dabble in things. I'm doing an AI workshop in February with Indian River State College where I advise at. And so I get to do things that are interesting. For the last couple of months, I've gotten fairly active on LinkedIn as a place to post ideas and stuff. And people haven't booed too bad. And
You've been having some fun on LinkedIn lately.
yeah, but it's there's a lot of things that you try to talk about and you think about. And so I think one of the things I'm trying to get people to really understand is as much as we make the business complex, everybody talks about mission creep. I said, well, don't be successful. They won't ask you to do anything. It's really getting people to understand that this is a profession, whether you degree or not, whether you are, acronyms after your name, whether you're CEM or whatever.
Hmm.
Um, it's about the outcome of an event you did not cause. And
Yeah.
that change that for the better and speed and making decisions. And it's almost like getting people that are used to working in a set rule-based structure where mistakes are more punished than taking risk, and risk is very rarely rewarded, and going, that works day to day. In a disaster, it's a failure.
Hmm.
And getting people to go, you need to be able to understand when you're in that disaster that it's not an emergency, that it requires you now to do things that normally in the course of your business you would never consider. But if you don't, um, you're going to be too slow with too little
Hmm.
and fail.
Yeah.
And you've been in government, for a lot of career folks, that's not an easy switch. And so a lot of things I did at FEMA was almost like the brute force of trying to get us
Hmm.
to that point where at least if they weren't consciously throwing the switch, you were throwing it for them and putting them in that environment. And what was interesting, by the time I got to the end of FEMA, there were a lot of people already anticipating and moving and doing stuff that got built into that framework, but it was not something
Hmm.
at the beginning they were comfortable doing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it really pushed people to start thinking differently, right?
That's what I post, and hopefully it's triggering some of that.
Yeah, I think it does. It gets a lot of conversation started. So I think it's important. It's important to use your voice and use your expertise to continue to drive change. So if emergency management does its job well over the next decade, what do you think will be different for survivors when a disaster hits?
Unfortunately, people are still going to die. People are going to lose their homes. People will lose their possessions. But I think if we're successful, um, we help people rebuild their lives with dignity and their control, that we are supporting the communities and getting them back to not the way it was.
Hmm.
And in some cases, you never get back to the way it was, but you get it back to where it's stable and you buy time for the policymakers to go, what's next? I think sometimes emergency managers think we got to solve all the problems and the community needs to be resilient, everything else 10 years later. I'm like, sometimes I think we just need to give enough time to get it stable enough where now policymakers and elected leaders can make those next steps and we can, be part of that process.
Hmm.
But in many cases, I think sometimes I run into some emergency managers, they're so focused on resilience and we got to be doing all this stuff. I'm like, guys, you got to get to a point after a disaster where you can even start talking about resilience. If people are still not found, you
Yeah.
still have debris down, the power's not back on,
Yeah.
nobody's going to listen to you. And I think that's one of the things that I keep. You got to be fast, you got to get stable. It's amazing. The quicker we get to a point of it's not getting any worse, the faster we can get to those next conversations.
Yeah.
And then, especially when governors and mayors are talking about, I can remember the governor of Colorado after the Front Range floods was saying, we're not building it back the way that it was because it got washed out. We're building it back better. And early on, as we were still responding, that set the tone before anybody started making any repairs. He'd already defined it as, we're not putting it back the way it was.
Well, sir, I want to just thank you before we wrap here for your leadership, your service to this field, to our nation, but especially for keeping disaster survivors at the center of your work. I think your impact has really been felt in very real ways, and I, for one, am very grateful to have had the chance for this conversation. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And that's a wrap on this episode of Careers and Coffee Talk. Big thanks to today's guests for pouring out so many great insights. And hey, thanks to you for hanging out with us. If this episode gave you a little jolt of inspiration or made your day a bit more brewed and balanced, be sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Got a minute? Drop me a 5-star review. It's basically the podcast equivalent of buying me a fancy oat milk latte. Quick disclaimer though, the views expressed in this episode are personal and do not reflect those of any organization. Anyway, until next time, stay curious, stay caffeinated, and keep chasing the career that makes you feel the most alive. Catch you next time.